Friends, I'm not going to spend too much time introducing Jessica because we just need to go right into this. But if you've read kind of the promotional pieces, Jessica is the executive director of Next Church, which she might tell you more about. But I'd like to just invite you to join me, please, at this time and just do a warm welcome for Jessica Tate.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really great to be with you this morning. I'm a Presbyterian minister and the director of Next Church, which is an organization within the Presbyterian denomination that's trying to help us look at the systems and structures of our churches, because we know that the models of church that have been with us for several generations simply aren't working as well in today's world. So we're trying to trust that God is pulling us into the future and wanting to follow that where God's Spirit is leading, and help strengthen our leaders and our congregations so that our congregations can be faithful, sustainable, effective agents of God's transformation in our communities for the common good. So we do work all over the country, mainly with Presbyterians, but with anybody who would like to talk to us, and we love learning from everyone. So it's good to be with you this morning. The other piece about my biography that might be helpful to you is that I am a Presbyterian minister and served my first congregation in Northern Virginia. And while I was there, our church was doing a lot of work with community organizing, congregationally based community organizing, with a group in Virginia called Voice, which is a sister organization to AIM, which I believe you all are part of. So I learned really what my job was as a pastor. I mean, I feel like I learned more from community organizing about how to do my job than I did in seminary. I learned a lot in seminary about what my job is and the theology of the church and all of that. And then I feel like I learned the skills and tools of how to do my job from community organizing. So what I'm going to offer this morning is a little piece of the window of community organizing as it's taught by the Industrial Areas Foundations, which is the largest and oldest faith-based community organizing network in the country. And AIM is part of that network. So before I jump into teaching you about relational meetings, I want to set the cultural context just a little bit, because I think we're living in a really interesting point in time in the history of this country. Mark Dunkelman wrote a book I think a year and a half ago now, called The Vanishing Neighbor. And in that book, he makes the case that some of what we're seeing in our country is a loss of what he calls middle ring relationships, that my grandparents' generations ahead of ours, were really conscientious about building and sustaining public relationships that were kind of in the middle ground. And he says, by virtue of just individual choices that so many of us are making today, we tend to focus our time and energy on either the private, intimate relationships in our lives or the very casual ones. So the casual, like saying hi to the cashier at the grocery store, but not knowing anything about them, or our intense friendships from a long time ago that we're able to keep connected with because of travel and Facebook and social media and cell phones and free long distance and all the things that weren't available to us generations ago. So we've lost that middle ring of relationships, is the argument he's making. Another person whose work I've been paying attention to lately is Sari Ateek. She's a psychologist from MIT, and she studies the relationship between technology and people, and particularly lately, the relationship between people as it relates to technology. And one of the ways she does this, she does a lot of just observing people in groups, but one of the places she studies is 12-year-old birthday parties. And she says that 20 years ago, when she was starting her career, she would go to a 12-year-old birthday party, and it would go something like this, that there'd be, everyone's arriving, and there's about 15 minutes that's incredibly awkward. We all probably remember this, that you come in, you don't really know who else is coming, you're not really sure how to interact yet, the group hasn't formed, maybe there's snacks out, maybe there's not, so you try to find something to do to occupy yourself for those first few minutes, and then ultimately people kind of figure it out. You have to risk engaging someone, you figure it out, and the party goes off with a bang. She says now what happens is that people come, there's that awkward, I don't know who's coming, I don't know anybody here yet, and what do we do now? Pull out our phone and we text, are you coming to this? Or we see what else is going on in the world, we read an article on our phones. technology has shifted greatly the way we engage other people in relationship. And it's not just 12-year-olds. I've been at adult parties where that very same thing happens. So it's shifting the way we connect with one another. And then Brene Brown, who many of you probably are familiar with her work that's taken off over the last few years, she has been writing a lot about the power of connection and the need for connection in our lives. I want to read one quote from her because it really gets to the heart of why I think these relational meetings and these connections with one another are important. She says this: "Connections are energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and then they derive some sustenance and strength from that relationship." And she says, connection begets connection. So in this time that we are living, where we're increasingly actually disconnected from many people who populate our lives, I think it behooves us to be engaged in intentionally rekindling those muscles that I think have atrophied in us, of how do we build relationships with the people who populate our lives. And theologically, I think about this in terms of Presbyterians are really big on covenant. And you may remember that in the book of Exodus, God makes a covenant with Moses and the people of Israel in a pretty dire situation. They haven't yet left Egypt, and they're not sure that's ever going to happen. They'll ever get out of slavery. And God says to Moses, "I will be your God, and you will be my people." Makes that covenant with them. And what strikes me about that is that it's not, you will be a collection of individuals who are with God. It's, you will be my people, that there's some cohesiveness there to us. I think it's the same thing that happens in the celebration of communion when we are remembered to Christ and to one another. So the practice of building and deepening relationships to strengthen us as a community, as a people of God, is a really important skill. And I know probably most churches I go into and say, what keeps you at this church? People will say, well, the people. So we do have those relationships already. And yet at the same time, I know it's also true that we can sit on a pew with someone for decades and never actually know what's really going on in their lives. To not know that they had a child who died when they were young, or not to know that they've lost a job, or that a loved one has just been diagnosed with cancer, or all the things that are actually the stuff that keeps us up at night. We often don't know that. We don't have that level of relationship with one another. So the individual meeting, the relational meeting, is a tool to help us engage in those relationships a little bit more deeply. And it doesn't mean that everybody in the congregation or everybody that we encounter in the world needs to become our best friend. Not at all. But it is helping us to figure out how we deepen public relationships so that we can engage with one another and work together for God's work in the world. So there's a handout up here. Perfect.
All right, I got it.
Perfect. So the case I'm really trying to make this morning is that we need to relearn the art of deepening relationships and being more deeply connected with one another, and take seriously the image of God in each other.
Sorry, Jessica.
No, you're fine. So one tool to do this is to practice this art of relational meetings. And this is a radical tool of the Industrial Areas Foundation. And they call it radical because most of us just simply don't do it very often. We populate our conversations with, how is the soccer game? What's the weather? What are your travel plans for Thanksgiving? And not the stuff that goes one level beneath that, or even a couple levels beneath that. So the purpose of the relational meeting is to try to understand what makes someone tick. What are the stories that have populated your life, who've shaped you into the person that you are, and why you care about the things that you care about. Reverend Clark's sermon addressed that some this morning too, of what are the stories and the people who have shaped us to make us who we are, and why we act in the world the way that we do. So one of the most important questions you can ask in a relational meeting is why questions. Why did you choose that? Why was that interesting to you? Why was that worth your energy and time? The pastor of the church that I attend now, Roger Gensch, he says that when you engage in this act of relational meetings, that often what comes out in these stories that people tell are the very deep hopes and very deep pain often. And he says it actually becomes a holy encounter with the crucified and risen Christ that we can actually see in one another, that it creates this really holy space for us to engage in. So look on your sheet for just a second. There's a little chart there of what relational meetings are and are not. And this is important. They are, as I said, a radical tool of the Industrial Areas Foundation. They're usually done one-to-one, so one person with one other person. They're best done face-to-face, although sometimes life doesn't let that happen, and we can do them over the phone or over FaceTime, something like that. They're not very long, 30 to 40 minutes in an ideal setting, but they're also, I find, the tools of relational meetings can be used anytime. It can be used while you're walking out to the car with someone after worship today, to just, rather than say, how about the weather, ask a different kind of question. So even around the coffee hour, you can have these different kinds of relational meetings. They're reciprocal. They involve both sharing your own story and listening for the other person's story. And they're an art form or a practice. They're not a scientific method that you can just run through. So it's important to say what they're not. They're not just chit-chat that we often get caught in doing. They're not a survey or an interview that we're trying to mine the other person for information. They're not data collection to see where can I plug you in later to my whatever volunteer need I'm trying to fill right now. They're not selling your own agenda for, I want to make sure that people come on this mission trip that we're going to, so I'm meeting with people to sell them on this agenda. That's not what they are. They're also not gossip. They're not complaint. They're not ain't it awful sessions, although you may find some things that you agree with are awful in the world. And they're not one way. They are reciprocal conversations. And they're not a technique in a very literal kind of sense. They are an art or a practice. And the purpose of them, as it says there, is to establish or deepen a public relationship so that we can strengthen the relational fabric of our communities and create the sense that we are a people together. So we're going to spend the balance of our time this morning practicing these together. Sari and I are going to demonstrate one as a kind of fishbowl setting, and we'll do that for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to pause, and I'm going to ask you, if you were sitting in the seats up here, what would be the next question you would ask? So be an active listener in this conversation. And after that, we're going to break up into pairs and have you actually try one of these for about 10 minutes, and then share our reactions to that together before we close. So, Sari, will you join me up here?
Turn mine on. 1, 2. Yeah.
Okay. So thanks for the invitation for me to be here this morning, and also for being willing to share some of your story with me and with all of us today. So usually when I would do these, I would start with a pretty broad question. But since we're here kind of in a particular circumstance, I want to share a little bit with you about some experiences I've had in my life that have really made me really passionate about these relational meetings and taking seriously the individual relationships in my life. One of those is from when I was in college. I was the director of a program called Project Starfish in the summer, and worked with kids who were in second grade and were really behind in their reading, and the purpose of the program was to try to catch them up over the summer. So I was the director of that program, and one of the joys of being the director was the administrative and disciplinary part of that role. It was not a joy actually at all. But there was one little girl who was late every single day for school, and that meant she was getting there in time for the swimming part of the summer camp, but missing the reading instruction. So one day I pulled her into the office and just said, Lakeisha, you've got to get here on time. What is going on? And she said to me, after some prodding, well, my mom drives a taxi and she works all night, so she's not home when I leave for school. And I feel like I had one of those scales falling off my eyes moments of realizing this 7-year-old gets herself up, gets dressed, gets breakfast if there's any food in the house, and then has to get herself to the bus stop. And if she doesn't make it to the bus stop, walk here. And just the difference between that story and my own, where I had two parents at home, both there all morning, getting me up, feeding me breakfast, getting my lunch packed and out the door. It was a really powerful moment of kind of the assumptions that I'd made about what is available to the children that we were serving versus my own experiences. And that really shifted in me, like, wow, everybody's got a story, and I need to be a better curator and learner of those stories before I make judgments about them. And another quick one from serving in the church was we had a guy who was a CEO in our congregation, and we were looking for someone to lead a capital campaign. So I was tasked with making the ask of him of, will you chair the capital campaign committee? And I went and I asked him, I didn't know him really well, but I knew him kind of Sunday morning well, like, very friendly. And I asked, and his face just fell. And I went, oh no, like, this was a big ask. We needed you to say yes. And then luckily I'd had some relational meeting training, and so I very quickly pivoted and just said, your face just fell, what's going on? And he said that he's, through the course of the conversation then, became clear that he's always asked to do leadership, strategic visioning things, and he does that all week. He does that 60 hours a week. He doesn't want to do that in church too. And I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, I don't get to see my grandchildren ever. I would love to teach preschool Sunday school. I was like, oh, well, do I have a deal for you? But again, it was sort of that I'd pigeonholed him based on my thoughts about who he might be, and didn't take the time to hear his own story. And it was a really powerful moment when he was willing to share it, and powerful for me to hear. So I'm curious about you. Are there some stories or moments or teachers along the way for you that have made relationship building an important thing for you?
I did not plant her for some of these things that you're mentioning. It's like, yes, this whole volunteer issue is really important to us. As you were talking about listening to that young girl and hearing her story and how that shaped you, one of the stories that has shaped me the most probably in my life is my friend Ben. We had gone to undergrad together, and actually before my wife and I were ever married, this guy was kind of like the mentor for us in college. He was just a couple of years ahead of us, spiritual leader on campus. And one of the things in the evangelical world, because this was back in Alabama, in the evangelical world, like, there was this thing called the testimony, right? And we don't talk about that much in the Episcopal Church, giving your testimony. But his testimony was very clear that he had, when he had hit puberty, he realized that he was attracted to boys and not girls. And so, but his testimony back in those days was, but God has healed me. And I'm going somewhere with this. You're like, oh God, what am I stepping into here, right?
No, I'm sure it's going somewhere. It's very
like, God healed me, and so God can heal you if you're gay, and all this. And I'd come from a Palestinian background, so we don't even talk about sexuality over there. It's just assumed everyone's heterosexual, and it's seen as a deviance. So we had spent a lot of time kind of going out. I'm a musician, so I'd play the music. We'd be invited to speak to groups, and I'd be like the musician. He'd give his testimony, and then there'd be like an altar call of some kind. And it would relate to all kinds of ways of healing in your life. It's not just, the ultimate point wasn't just the sexuality takeaway kind of thing. But then we ended up in seminary together. And my wife and I were married at this point, and he's still our best friend. And he came to our room one day, or our apartment, and he just broke down into tears, and he said, I can't do this anymore. And this was like, we'd known him for 6 years by this point, 7 maybe. And we were like, what are you doing? He's like, I have to be authentic. Like, I've said that God has healed me, but the truth is I wrestle with this every day, and I just feel like I'm not honoring how God has made me. And it was this big shift for him. And we wept, and we're like, don't go down that road. Like, our worlds weren't big enough at that point to even think about that this would be something that was okay with God. And so he he said, I'm taking a risk, like if I'm falling out of God's grace, I don't know, but I just need to be authentic. Mm-hmm. And I remember, like, we stayed up, Tannery and I didn't sleep, my wife Tannery, there were nights where we couldn't sleep, and she went over to his room and just knocked on his door and tried to, like, ask him to reconsider, and maybe there's hope. But anyway, once we realized that this is our friend and this is the journey he was going to go through, we decided that we had one of two options. The first option was to just say he's wrong, and to, like, enter into that space where we were always going to be adversarial with him and saying, like, God has a different plan for you and all of that. Or, given how well we know him and we knew his integrity, that we would actually ask ourselves to actually enter into a space where we're just going to listen, where we said, if he is saying, I'm not healed, then maybe we don't know enough about this. So we just entered into a season in our life where we said, let's not have an opinion on this at all. And let's just listen. And we listened to him, and we listened to a discourse that was happening in the Episcopal Church at that point. And where we came out on the other end after just journeying with him is a very different place, where our hearts were open to this whole idea of, we don't have to go into the theology of it right now because we don't have all the time, but we were in a very different place. And we had mutual friends who had taken the other approach of just saying, God is not okay with this. And so for me, that set the precedent of real compassionate listening, and also recognizing that there's a lot of things in life that I know nothing about. And it's so easy to come in top down. But the other piece that connected for me is, as a Palestinian, I'd had scripture used against me so much in my life, and people telling me that I didn't belong, or that I had to change in order to be accepted, or I had to recognize that my home didn't belong to me, and it was promised to someone else. And I felt that similar exclusion that comes from scripture. So one of the things that came out of this, walking with my friend and his journey and reflecting more on my life, is that I have a passion now around using scripture to liberate and not oppress. So anywhere in life where I feel like the Bible is being used to tell people that they ought to, or they should, or they should deny themselves somehow of something that they really believe is a blessing and not a curse, that I just have this approach where the Bible is meant to liberate. And that's the story that comes with my passion around liberation and justice. And so
that's awesome. How do you see that shaping your ministry today?
So I think it's an orientation every time I come to preach. It's avoiding the easy, maybe black and white answer in, like, sometimes there's the temptation to take a piece of scripture and just say, like, this is teaching this, and you just go with it. But if it feels like it's got a lot of obligation kind of stuck with it, it's a different approach to it. I believe that people come to church oftentimes with a lot of guilt. Some denominational backgrounds also kind of reinforce looking at what you've done wrong instead of how you are so beautiful and so right. And so I feel like it informs that for me, is bringing beauty and seeing hope instead of just seeing how we've screwed up. And then also I think, and I think I've shared this recently with the church, but stepping into the U.S. culture, even though I am Palestinian and I grew up in Israel, Palestine, I definitely feel like I benefit from white privilege in this country. And so recently I've been much more attuned to how, like, my own feelings of prejudice, and that I don't talk about, and that I'm kind of ashamed of, that are in the background, like when a car full of black people pulls up next to me. As open-minded and as progressive as I am, when I recognize that I have like this gut instinct, you know, of just like, it's not the same as if it was a bunch of white teenagers, then I pay attention to that, and and that all of that comes from this space where I'm like, how can I not go with the prejudice, but I've trained myself to listen to the areas in my life where if I feel scared or if I feel like I am threatened, I stop and I take a step back, and I ask some more questions of myself and where I need to be listening more. So this whole subject of racial injustice in our country has become a big passion of mine. And anyway, a lot of it goes back to those conversations with Ben.
Yeah.
So,
do you have a sense, I mean, it sounds like in that, Ben was your seminary friend. It sounds like you and your wife took the path less traveled by your immediate group. What gave you the courage to take that path?
Yeah.
Or the, you know?
It's a good question. It was definitely less traveled. I don't know about, but definitely it was the less comfortable path because it required a change of me, right? And I think what gave me the motivation to do it was because we were committed to him as a person, and I think had there not been a relationship there, it would have been easy to continue to be dogmatic about it. But because there was a relationship, I realized that like it was a harder thing to just have an opinion on that subject. It needed a lot more listening, and I do feel this is one of the reasons you're here, Jessica, is I feel there's so much power in relationships, and it's one of the things I'm hoping for all of us that we can tap more into at St. John's, because that's how we take the next step in our life together, is when we're committed to one another on a deeper level. So.
Great. I'm going to pause us there. Obviously, we could go on for a long time, and Sari is being a very generous conversation partner and connecting dots for me. And but what question comes to your mind? What would you ask next if you were either one of us? Where's your curiosity taking you?
What's your relationship with Ben now?
Ben is one of our closest friends. It's kind of a lifelong friend. I'm terrible at keeping in touch with people in general. I'm great with my parishioners, but then my aunts are calling me all the time like, well, you're a terrible priest, you know. You never keep in touch with me. I'm like, yeah, but I do so good with my parishioners, not so good in my personal lives. But Ben was just over visiting us a couple of months ago, and it's one of those lifelong sacred relationships where I realized that most of the parts of my life, being a priest, being progressive, seeing justice issues, all of them, meeting Tannery, all of them connect back to Ben. And so, lifelong, yeah.
And you don't have to answer all these questions.
No, thanks.
So just,
thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah. So let's just shout out the
Questions.
questions we would ask, but we're not going to take time to answer them because I want you to have a turn to talk to each other.
What do you do with your fear?
What do you do with your fear?
Hey, Justin, can you turn that mic up if you can? Thanks. Okay, there you go.
That's a great question. Yeah. What other? A few more hands over here.
It's okay. We'll repeat the questions up here, Jessica. You repeat them for the microphone.
So knowing me now, and not then, it's hard to imagine you as a judgmental person. It occurred to me that impression is itself a rather judgmental one.
Yeah.
How do you see your overall goals or your mission in society? Do you see it as basically the same now and then, or is there some kind of critical difference?
That's a great question. So the question is, knowing Sari now, it's hard to imagine him as a judgmental person before. And therefore, how does he see his life goals and mission as the same now and then, or have they shifted over time? It's really hard not to let you answer that question because I'm curious too. What other questions? Yeah.
Sarah, you lived in the Middle East, and then you moved to Alabama. Both areas
Great, that's another good question. So having lived in the Middle East and then Alabama, both being places where people are judged by their appearance, how have you noticed that being true or not? You all are good at this. This is great. So thank you, Sari, for being willing to be a guinea pig up here. It is now your turn. So turn to someone that's nearby, but not someone that you came with this morning or that you live with. Although I encourage you to do this with the people that you live with, because you maybe don't actually at home either. But for our purposes now, find a partner and take 10 minutes.
And there's going to be an invitation at the end of this. It's not a pledge invitation like we're doing in there, but it is a pledge. And we'll talk about that in a second. Let me turn it over to Jessica for a little bit.
So just quickly, popcorn, some of your, how was that? Thumbs up, good? Where'd you get stuck? You didn't? Good, yeah.
Friends, I'm sorry, we really need to listen up. If you're talking, please stop. 1, 2.
The problem with hearing, yeah, and that obviously.
We're shouting.
Right, right. So this is not the ideal setting, right? You'd want to find a time where you could be in a quiet setting with someone, for sure. Yeah. Any other places you got stuck?
Time pressure.
Time pressure, sure. Yep. But isn't it also amazing how much you can learn in 10 minutes if you're being attentive to that? So you really could change your initial questions at coffee hour, right? And have an entirely different, you could have 3 little mini meetings with people just in the social hour and still get, to brunch. So it's amazing. It's amazing. What else? Yeah.
I think starting with the beginning of my story,
Starting with a little bit of your story?
Yeah.
What did that do? How did that help?
That helped me think back to what I had done in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great insight, because some of what these meetings do is also help you reflect on yourself and being a good curator of your own life story, and then also helping the other person. It's an invitation to the other person to think more deeply about their own story. I often, when I'm doing these, find out, I never put that together, that it was that experience that is why I'm passionate about this thing today. So you often learn about yourself. One of the things I want to challenge you to do is to, well, first of all, just do these meetings, whether it's informally around the coffee or in a more formal way by actually taking a risk to invite some people to meet you for 30 minutes. But also, in organizing, they talk about the difference between agitating someone. So you can think about an agitation in a good way, like when you put your clothes in the washer, you want them to get agitated so some stuff shakes loose, right? So taking a risk with a question you might ask, knowing, gosh, this feels like more than I would normally ask of someone. This feels like it's probing a little more than I'm accustomed to asking. To take a risk to agitate the person a little bit, but be cautious that you're not irritating them. If their body language goes real negative, back up. So you want to try to dance on that line of agitating and probing enough that you get below the surface, because a lot of us are pretty honed at the surface level chit-chat kind of conversation, and so it takes some risk to get us to go a little bit deeper. So I encourage you to take that risk. And the other thing I would invite you to connect to, as you're getting into some of these more, why is this true of me, that I care about these things? Why is this true of the other person? To try to tap into anger, which is a really funny thing. We don't usually think about anger and church going together. But some of what anger is related to is our deep grief in the world. So you heard some of my story about that child, that 7-year-old whose mom drove a taxi and she didn't have any way to get to school. That makes me angry that is so far from my experience, that I had so much privilege at home that I didn't even know I had, and that there are children who it behooves them as 7-year-olds to get themselves to school. Something is screwed up in our culture, that is the reality. So it's that kind of anger that's usually born of grief, but that can be the fire. I mean, I was 20, that was almost 30 years ago that happened, and I still remember that story, that moment, and it still drives me to do the work that I do today. So tapping in to that anger or that grief that people have is something we often shy away from because that makes everybody uncomfortable, but is usually the portal into what's really going on with someone, too. So I'm going to let Sari have the last word, but thank you for letting me be with you today.
So, thank you, Jessica. Friends, I hope that you experienced how much potential there is in the relationships that we have here. And you're just tapping into one other person's story here. Think about all the stories at St. John's where you can, there's so much to talk about. I want to invite you to be courageous, because in your own relationships outside of the church, even if people aren't being set up like this, like have a relational meeting, go, even when they're not being set up for it, I believe that most people are dying for authentic connection. And if you have the courage to take the conversation to a deeper level, as Jessica is saying, it will bless not only your interaction with them, but that it's like salve on wounds. It's like really meaningful for people to say, like, I just had 20 conversations with people, and every one of them had to do the same stuff, the weather and all kind of stuff. But then there was that one interaction where that person asked me a deeper question. And I appreciate that in my own life, and I know others will. So I encourage you to be courageous. Here's a cool opportunity that Action in Montgomery is putting together. It's called Relational Meeting, Potluck, and Islam. And it's basically, it's kind of a same thing that Jessica was talking about today. They're going to do relational meeting trainings, except you do it in a context where where it's Christians and Muslims and Jews and other religions, kind of coming together, but specifically focused on Islam. So imagine how cool this is to take your story and someone else's story and ask deeper questions in a safe setting with people who are Muslim. I mean, it's just like a beautiful opportunity. So this is something that's happening on November 30. There's flyers right here. You can take it just even if you want to practice. Can I invite you to make a pledge that between now and the end of December, and this is going to be easy, I'm not going to overload you, but have 2 relational meetings with people from this church. Just look them up on Breeze, our whatever it's called, database. Shoot them an email and just say, can we go out to coffee? Or do it on a Sunday morning if just hanging out between services. 2 people between now and December. Eventually, my hope is that we will become just comfortable enough with doing this that I might organize a group to go out into our neighborhood just to get to know our neighbors. If you're courageous enough to do that with me. Gary.
Does this count as one of them?
I'm not even going to answer that question.
Can I make one more suggestion?
Yes, please.
Also, probably many of you are going to be gathered with loved ones over Thanksgiving. That's a great time to practice these. The stuff I've learned about my family members and changing the kind of questions I was talking about has been amazing. So and they already love you, so it's an easier setting, hopefully, to do that.
Let's thank Jessica.
You're welcome.